Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club here in Canberra and to today's Westpac address. And we are delighted to have one of the world's real experts on an issue that has become front page news, not just in this country, but in practically every country in the world. Of course, I'm talking about cybersecurity. We have someone who has spent the best part of 27 years grappling with the complexities, the challenges, opportunities perhaps, of information warfare, of cybersecurity, which of course, due to some recent high-profile incidents in this country, everyone is talking with, everyone is trying to work out how to deal with this issue. Retired US Army Major General John Davis is Vice President, Public Sector for Palo Alto Networks. He's here on a tour of Australia to talk about cybersecurity. Please welcome John Davis.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for the kind invitation to be with you today. I'm very grateful to the National Press Club for giving me this opportunity, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay their respects to elders, past and present. I'd also like to welcome the distinguished guests that we have gathered here today. It's my honor to share some thoughts with you about a topic that I consider is extremely important in the modern era. I intend to discuss what our adversaries have been doing in the information realm over the past several years and the associated implications. I'm then going to talk about some of the work that I've been doing internationally to encourage responsible nations to follow several operational rules of the road for the employment of cyber capabilities and why these rules are important. And then finally, I'd like to talk about what we've been seeing and perhaps not seeing from Russia when it comes to the use of cyber capabilities in Ukraine. But first, I'd like to provide you with a bit more detail about my background and experiences, as I think that you might find it interesting. And this will give you some context for the topics that I'm going to share and why I believe in the importance of information warfare, including the use of cyber in modern competition and conflict. Before joining Palo Alto Networks in 2015, I was in the US military for more than 35 years. I realized that I may not look like it anymore, but most of my career I served in airborne Ranger infantry and special operations assignments. In the mid-90s, I was the future plans officer in an organization called US Atlantic Command, which no longer exists, responsible for overseeing United Nations operations in Haiti following our intervention in that country. At the same time, our Marine four-star general commander began asking our team to develop an information warfare campaign designed to prevent the need for executing one of our war plans against an adversary nation in our area of responsibility. And if we couldn't prevent it, to make sure that we could at least execute the war plan in the most efficient and effective way in terms of resources, casualties, and operational success. Well, that task from the general worked its way down the chain of command to me. And my first response was, what the heck is information warfare? So like a good young major, I began to immerse myself into learning about this mysterious world called information warfare in between trips to Haiti. And I quickly learned the arts and sciences around the various components of information warfare. There were weird things like psychological operations and operations security, or OPSEC, and how that was related to military public affairs and what we could say publicly. It also included military deception, electronic warfare, information assurance, public diplomacy, how to use force posture and movement to signal capabilities and intentions to friends and enemies alike, and several other secretive information-related functions in the categories of special technical operations and special access programs. One of the functions that really piqued my interest was what we called back then computer network operations, which came in three forms: exploitation, defense, and attack. And this eventually evolved into cyber operations. This was a whole new, exciting world to a simple ranger like me, and after about a year, I suddenly found myself in a very small, secure room, known as a skiff, in Washington, D.C., on a Saturday morning, briefing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA director, the Deputy Secretary of State, the Deputy Attorney General, the Director of NSA, the FBI Director, and several other extremely high-ranking U.S. government officials on our information warfare plan to prevent a war, but how it would also enable us to fight it more successfully if prevention failed. Well, I can tell you that that was an eye-opening experience for a junior officer like me. And I quickly realized a couple of things that would change the trajectory of my career. First, this thing called information warfare was the future of modern competition and conflict. Second, doing things like this required a whole-of-government approach because no single entity had all of the capabilities, capacities, skills, and talent, resources, or, importantly, authorities to act effectively in isolation. And interaction, coordination, and cooperation with allies and partners and even industry was required. And then the final thing that I learned was this was very difficult stuff, especially for Western democratic governments that believe in pesky little things like separation of power, strict civilian oversight and control, and who have a natural predilection for restraint and saving military capabilities for only the break glass in case of traditional war scenarios. But I was hooked. And in the late 90s, I became one of the U.S. Army's first functional area 30s. These are information warfare professionals. And then I got the opportunity to put my skills to the test in the special operations community, including during our hunt for persons indicted for war crimes in the Balkans, numerous classified special operations around the world, during the initial invasion of Afghanistan following 9/11, and during subsequent operations in support of both Afghanistan and Iraq. Following that, I returned to the traditional Army to bring what I had learned about information warfare in the special operations community, and I was selected to command the Army's only active duty information warfare brigade. In this assignment, one of my battalions was responsible for defending the U.S. Army's global networks, and I had 6 regional computer emergency response teams positioned around the world, in addition to the Army's global computer emergency response team near Washington, D.C. This was 2006 to 2008. And because there was a growing recognition among our military senior leadership of both the increasing cyber threats to and vulnerabilities of our military networks and critical infrastructure, as I was promoted to Brigadier General in 2008, I was given strictly cyber assignments from that point forward. I led a joint task force responsible for directing the operations and defense of all of DoD's networks. I helped stand up U.S. Cyber Command and became its first Director of Current Operations, responsible for not only directing the operations and defense of all DoD's networks, but directing offensive cyber operations against our adversaries when authorized by the President. After promotion to Major General, I became the first senior military cyber advisor at the Pentagon, and then was appointed as the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber Policy, and was responsible for DoD's cyber strategy and policy, interagency cyber coordination, international cyber cooperation, and interaction with the private sector defense industrial base on cybersecurity. And of course, following my military career, I've continued to stay on the cyber team, just playing from a different position within the world's leading cybersecurity company. Well, you know who else besides me was hooked on information warfare and cyber operations back in the late 90s? Our adversaries saw the results of the use of these capabilities by the U.S. and its partners and allies around the world, and they studied what we were doing very closely. And they were particularly concerned with what they perceived as the use of covert and clandestine information warfare, resulting in the color revolutions in Eastern Europe and Iran, and especially the Arab Spring across the Middle East. I believe that there is nothing that scares Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea more than this because it represents the single biggest threat to their regimes. So this is why I believe that our adversaries have invested significantly in the development of and implementation of information warfare. And cyber has emerged as one of the most prolific tools in the information warfare kit bag. So given that as context, let me now share with you my lessons from these experiences about how our adversaries have learned from all of this and their view of the use of information warfare and cyber operations to shape advantages against their adversaries, as well as some of the important implications. I believe that we're going to continue to see each of our adversaries operate in what has become known as the gray zone, below the traditional threshold for the use of force or armed aggression that would trigger a traditional physical response from the countries that they target. And we'll talk later about what happens once traditional kinetic operations begin when I speak about Russia and Ukraine. The absence of effective regulating global norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, I believe, is going to continue to provide our adversaries with significant opportunities and even encouragement for offensive cyber action as part of their information warfare efforts. This is in part because of the absence of negative consequences from the countries they target, as has usually been the case thus far, with only a few exceptions for limited periods of time and having limited impact on the adversary in response to their use of these offensive operations. Traditionally, there has been little cost and much benefit associated with the decision to employ offensive cyber operations short of traditional conflict for relatively limited purposes. These operations might include, number one, espionage to enable other offensive cyber operations, including using the result of these operations to enable disinformation, misinformation, distortion of messages to fit an extreme agenda for divisiveness, weaponization of social media forums, and capabilities to create or exaggerate division, as is already seen in the case of Russia against the US and other Western democracies, and now increasingly seen from China, Iran, and even North Korea. Number two, reconnaissance and prepositioning to enable the future capability for offensive effects. As an example, the black energy bot that was discovered in the US energy sector is a good example of that. And that was about a decade ago. Number three, testing for effectiveness on a small scale and to gauge reaction from the targeted country. As an example, the cyber breach that you might be familiar with of a New York dam a few years ago, that's one example of this. And number four, cyber operations designed to accomplish a wide range of outcomes, such as creating social chaos to undermine Western democratic institutions. The Russian activities during the US 2016 election and Brexit are two examples. Raising funds to circumvent sanctions. North Korea is a champion of this in terms of what they use for ransomware. Sending messages or signaling. The 2012 Iranian distributed denial of service of the US financial sector and the Las Vegas Sands hotel disruption are two examples. Stealing intellectual property or research for profit or advantage. China's probably the largest example of intellectual property theft, and COVID-19 vaccine research theft are two current examples. And this list goes on, with some of the latest examples including the use of third-party actors and organizations such as criminals, front companies, surrogates, moonlighting military and intelligence actors, patriotic hackers. And there are even activities specifically focusing on extremist, culturally divisive issues and applying them to weaken Western militaries. These types of operations have become especially attractive in recent years for our adversaries that want to operate in this gray zone because they see tremendous advantage over the US and Western democratic countries as opposed to fighting in the traditional physical dimensions where they likely conclude that they would lose under very costly circumstances. By operating in these ways below the traditional threshold, they can avoid the targeted country's determination that these actions have clearly crossed the threshold of the use of force, armed aggression, or hostile acts. And in this way, our adversaries have been able to frustrate targeted countries' responses. They've also seen tremendous effect at leveraging these types of cyber operations, combined with the broader information warfare aspect, in order to sow fear, divisiveness, uncertainty, and undermine the fabric of democratic societies. And very importantly, by operating in this fashion, our adversaries are able to avoid accountability and deny responsibility for direct involvement, while they actually inspire, turn a blind eye towards, or even covertly provide resources and direct third-party actors and organizations to do their bidding for them. The recent impact of a deadly global pandemic accompanied by severe world economic instability and recently inflamed racial tensions on top of an already divided society within many Western democracies presents an historical opportunity for our adversaries to gain an advantage over those democracies. Truth has never been put into more doubt, while selective truth and distortion to fit extreme agendas and vastly different worldviews on both sides of political and cultural divides has never been more powerful. I believe that Western nations are experiencing a time of great risk to national and international security, economic viability, public safety, and even societal stability. Our adversaries know this, and they are positioning themselves to gain an advantage with great urgency by using many of the information warfare techniques throughout the extremely fertile digital environment, including both traditional and social media. I don't know if this yet represents an existential problem, but it is certainly a situation our adversaries recognize as offering significant opportunities for a repositioning of advantage and relative power among nations, influencing Western domestic publics to cause both extremist sides of cultural and political divisions to demonize each other instead of recognizing the real foreign enemies hiding behind these and inflaming these activities is an increasingly powerful tool empowered by today's digital age. Our adversaries are attacking us with increasing speed and scale, using cyber and broader information warfare operations, because that's where they have an advantage over us. They're not hampered by those pesky little things like separation of power, and strict civilian oversight, control, and accountability, and they have no natural predilection for restraint or saving military capabilities for only those, break glass in case of traditional war scenarios. In my view, we're currently losing this battle, and a growing number of adversaries are using these capabilities to what I'll refer to as helping Western democracies tear themselves apart. Now I'd like to turn to the need for some internationally accepted operational rules of the road to prevent miscalculation, unintended escalation in this world of information warfare and cyber competition and conflict. I've been focusing the past 7 years on advocating for several what I call operational rules of the road in cyberspace. And I was actually focusing on this in my role at the Pentagon for almost 4 years before I retired. These are different from the more traditional United Nations group of government expert norms that you may have heard about over the past decade plus. The UNGGE, as it is known by, has been trying to codify international agreements about the types of cyber activities that should be required by responsible nations, like protecting online human rights and the right to privacy, as well as prohibited, such as to conduct or knowingly support activity contrary to international law that intentionally damages critical infrastructure. While there have been some successes, gaining agreement among the many nations involved in this UN effort, including China and Russia, has been difficult, uneven, and at times faltering. So I've taken a bit of a different approach, and I'm trying to do two things with what I'm calling these operational rules of the road for cyber activities. First, I think we should recognize that states are going to conduct cyber activities in pursuit of their state interests, and focus on the rules which states should abide by in order to increase transparency, stability, careful oversight and control by accountable entities, and more effective participation from the private sector in defense. At the same time, the proposed rules are designed to reduce uncertainty, reduce or eliminate the use of irresponsible parties, and minimize the chances of making a mistake leading to escalation inadvertently leading to escalation within the cyber realm and spilling over into the kinetic realm. And second, we should recognize that we should be realistic and focus on the practices that the U.S. and many of its allies are already doing, or at least trying to do, in order to encourage other nations like China, for example, as both a strategic competitor and in many ways even a partner, to do the same thing in its own best interests and help us set a more responsible and stable example for the rest of the world. So here are the 4 operational rules of the road for which I've been advocating in various international forums, including in China. Rule number 1, during peacetime, responsible nations should be more transparent about what they're doing in cyberspace and why they're doing these things. This should be done with law enforcement, domestic or homeland security, but especially with uniformed militaries of responsible nations. Now, obviously, in applying this rule, there's absolutely no expectation of total transparency. However, transparency that's greater than exists today can lead to greater trust, which can lead to greater cooperation and even teamwork on issues of common interest. Some say this is an unrealistic rule, but I believe there are practical reasons for pursuing this type of approach. As an example, in 2012 to 2015, the U.S. military distributed white papers about the establishment of the cyber mission forces under U.S. Cyber Command and each of the service cyber component commands. And we briefed not only U.S. government and military partners around the world, but we also briefed countries like Russia and China as well about the general force composition, its purpose, its missions, and how it would be accountable and controlled by responsible oversight. Additionally, in 2016, the U.S. military publicly declared that it was conducting offensive cyber operations against ISIS. While not disclosing any classified information, these efforts demonstrate the U.S. military's increased transparency with not only other partners, friends, and allies around the world, but also with competitors and potential adversaries. One of the dynamics making increased transparency possible is the increasingly lower bar for declassifying all things related to cyber. This is good on many practical levels. There are open, even public discussions today that simply could not have occurred only a few years ago because the U.S. and many of its allies, including Australia, lead by example and no longer classify cyber activities the way they used to. Additionally, recent public examples of greater transparency in threat attribution include the North Korean attack against Sony Pictures Entertainment and the subsequent sanctions, indictments, and international diplomatic condemnation, the Iranian distributed denial of service attack on the U.S. financial sector beginning in 2012, and the associated indictments of those responsible, China's PLA attacks to steal intellectual property on U.S. industry, resulting in indictments, and the Russian 2016 election interference and resulting sanctions, indictments, and other response activities. These are examples. There's good reason to increase the clarity, accuracy, and transparency by bringing these activities out of the darkness of the world of espionage and criminal activities and into more light associated with law enforcement, domestic security, and especially uniformed military operations. Doing so can contribute to decreased uncertainty, the reduction of the chances of mistakes, increased stability, and even increasing contributions to the concept of deterrence, because public and diplomatic exposure of malign cyber activity has become a powerful tool in some cases. Rule number 2, during peacetime and increased tension, and even during armed conflict for that matter, responsible nations should establish and enforce standardized procedures for effective oversight of military, law enforcement, and homeland security cyber operations. And this would include risk management assessment and control procedures that result in the following effective outcomes. Number 1, domestic and foreign policy oversight from competent authority as established by the nation. Number 2, technical oversight. This would include a technical gain versus loss assessment, which addresses the unintended consequences that might result from the discovery of the technical capability and its potential use against other targets, and a technical assurance assessment, which would provide, low, medium, high assurance levels that the capability will produce technical outcomes or effects as intended and not produce unintended consequences. Number 3, operational oversight with appropriate responsibilities, accountability, and command and control procedures that verify positive control within an authorized chain of command. And finally, number 4, legal review, which provides an assessment for both the capability itself as well as for the operation as it applies to either international law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, or other applicable domestic and international laws and agreements. Rule number 3, during peacetime and increased tension, responsible nations should share cyber threat intelligence for criminal and terrorist threats of common interest. Additionally, responsible nations should establish and enforce effective information sharing programs and platforms that are automated and format standardized to account for the speed and scale of today's modern threats. These cyber threat intelligence and information sharing programs should be focused on cyber threat indicators of compromise along the cyber threat life cycle, or kill chain as it's referred to, as well as contextual information. But they should not include personally identifiable information, protected health information, intellectual property, content, or any other type of information that would create surveillance, privacy, and liability, policy, and legal concerns. Cyber threat intelligence information sharing should be done government to government in appropriate diplomatic, law enforcement, domestic security, intelligence, and military channels. However, responsible nations should encourage sharing programs and platforms between government and industry, between industry and government, and within and across industry, as appropriate to national and international laws and agreements. The result of increased and effective information sharing, as described, is to help reduce what I'll call the noise-to-signal ratio, so that responsible nations can see and better focus on what's important and not be confused or distracted by the ever-increasing amount of cyber criminal and terrorist activity that might cloud an already confusing cyber landscape and contribute to misinterpretation, miscalculation, mistakes, and inadvertent escalation. And by the way, I'll have some lessons about this rule when I turn to the discussion of Russia and Ukraine. And finally, rule number 4, during peacetime and increased tensions, and especially during armed conflict for that matter, responsible nations should ban loosely controlled third-party actors and organizations from engaging in offensive cyber activities. These include what I spoke of earlier, the surrogates, the front companies, the technical research organizations, criminal entities, moonlighters, even patriotic hackers. These types of actors and organizations increase uncertainty, reduce stability, lack the oversight and control, as discussed in rule number 2, are driven by an assortment of high-risk motivations, and increase the chance of a miscalculation in attribution, as described in rule number 3, which could result in an unacceptably high risk of escalation, especially during times of high tension. Unfortunately, the world is seeing an increasing use of loosely controlled third-party entities by countries like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. To me, this is an alarming trend because the risk of a mistake happening or an unsanctioned action by someone with a personal motivation that results in a significant consequence is growing exponentially. And I believe there should be common interest from all responsible nations to prevent that from happening. Many have asked me if these operational rules are realistic, and I can only tell you that the United States government and military and an increasing number of US-based cybersecurity private sector companies not only think so, but are increasingly and actively pursuing each of the rules proposed here. So yes, the US can and is leading by example in these rules, and the US has been willing to and pretty effective in engaging with other great nations like Australia to broaden this effort, make it an international standard, and even improve on it. If you think about it, pursuing these rules in cyberspace is really no different than other international efforts among friends and adversaries alike regarding issues such as nuclear nonproliferation, anti-piracy, counterterrorism, and the elimination of child pornography. So finally, I'd like to discuss how cyber capabilities have been used in the lead up to and early phases of Russia's conflict in Ukraine, and address whether there have been any surprising lessons about what we've seen in terms of the use of cyber capabilities before and after the 24th of February of this year. I'm not sure there have been many surprises in how cyber operations were used in the lead up to Russia's war on Ukraine. Most of my colleagues across government, military, and industry expected to see a very robust Russian information warfare campaign, including cyber operations, waged against Ukrainian and NATO targets to set the stage for traditional combat operations. However, I have received many questions from industry colleagues about why we haven't seen more in terms of volume and level of impact from Russian cyber operations after the 24th of February. I think many people assumed that there would be more cyber activity than we have apparently witnessed once the armed aggression began. There may be at least 3 reasons we're not seeing a greater amount of cyber activity since the 24th of February. However, it's important to note that I don't think we know enough yet to draw many firm conclusions. Much more insights likely to be revealed over time. So it's still early days, and I consider what I'm going to tell you preliminary. First, cyber hasn't been as important or effective as an option for Russia after the 24th of February. I believe that while cyber operations provide our adversaries with a broad range of options in that gray zone, short of war, short of traditional conflict, they provide a much narrower range once that threshold has been crossed. Once kinetic operations begin, why rely on something where the probability of success or precise impact is less certain and effects may take an undetermined amount of time when you can bomb it or shoot it with much more certainty in terms of timing and impact? There's also quite likely a bit more going on in the cyber realm than we may realize. It simply hasn't risen to levels, at least publicly, that many had expected. For example, we know that Russia, both directly and by inspiring or ignoring third parties, has attempted to target and achieve some limited temporary successes against Ukrainian national and military command and control, media, the energy sector, and other critical infrastructure targets. At my last count, we've seen at least 7 different wiper cyber capabilities that Russia or its surrogates have unleashed on Ukraine that destroys specific data after the 24th of February. And in some cases, we've even seen Russia or its surrogates target some of the states that neighbor Ukraine and Russia. Therefore, it's not that Russia has jettisoned its use of cyber capabilities after crossing the traditional threshold of armed conflict. They're just not likely assessed by Russian decision makers as being as useful, and therefore not employed on the same scale as before the beginning of armed conflict. Note of caution, though. However, should Russia's traditional combat operations continue to stall or lose ground because of Ukraine's increasingly effective operations and because of Russia's lack of effective leadership, their logistical mismanagement, and plunging of soldiers' morale, this situation could change. And in this case, it might become increasingly likely that Russia would find the employment of non-traditional capabilities to include cyber more useful and begin to scale them back up. The second reason, Ukraine has quickly become a much tougher cyber target by becoming less vulnerable and more resilient to cyber attacks. There was rapid improvement in the Ukrainian cyber defenses and a steady sustainment both immediately prior to and since the initial surge following the 24th of February. I believe that given the steady rise of the cyber threat situation against Ukraine since at least the fall of 2021, the defensive posture for Ukraine's government, military, and critical infrastructure surged rapidly and has become more robust and resilient. The surge has made it more difficult for Russian cyber operations to be effective. This effect is due to several factors, but among the most impactful, in my view, has been the surge of support in the form of defensive cyber capabilities from U.S. and partner nation cybersecurity industry organizations to appropriate Ukraine authorities and critical infrastructure entities. And this is both directly to Ukraine and through U.S., its allies, NATO, and EU country channels. Additionally, cyber threat intelligence sharing from the U.S. and its allies, as well as NATO and EU countries, including from their commercial entities to the same Ukrainian authorities and critical infrastructure entities, improved Ukrainian visibility of and defense against specific Russian cyber threats. For example, my country was part of a much broader effort in the U.S. By companies to surge cybersecurity capabilities in support of Ukraine immediately following the 24th of February. And the U.S. wasn't the only country with private sector cybersecurity companies doing similar things. And on the issue of how data sovereignty issues can impact adversely cyber threat intelligence sharing and capability provision, here are some interesting things that we learned. Public reporting suggests that Ukraine's data protection law initially prohibited government authorities from processing and storing data in the public cloud, meaning that Ukrainian public sector digital infrastructure was run locally on servers physically located within the country's borders, and security data couldn't leave the country's borders. This not only made the Ukrainian government vulnerable to kinetic attacks, such as missile attacks and artillery bombardment, but also cyber attacks. In the early days of the conflict, Russia launched a series of cyber attacks, including those wiper software attacks that I mentioned, targeting on-premise computer networks. While a number of global technology firms, including Palo Alto Networks, rallied to support the Ukrainian government, the country's data laws restricted the support they were able to provide, as they were not able to export security data, such as network or threat telemetry data, for analysis. As security data could not be transferred offshore, the Ukrainian government was unable to draw on global expertise to identify and mitigate threats and deploy preventive measures. Technology companies were also prevented from offering industry-leading solutions, as most solutions would see security data transferred offshore. Recognizing this issue and the associated vulnerability, the Ukrainian Minister of Digital Transformation and his colleagues in Parliament amended its data protection law to allow government data to move off existing on-premise servers and into the public cloud. Following these amendments, several technology companies supported both the transition of data to the public cloud, but also the Ukrainian government's operational response to cyber attacks. The Ukrainian experience illustrates the importance of dispersed and distributed digital operations and data assets across borders, and provides an excellent example, in my view, of how nations are able to become much tougher targets for cyber exploitation and attack. And now the third reason that I don't think we've seen more cyber activity than many anticipated: Russia's decision makers could be hesitant to increase the scale and impact of some of its cyber operations, considering the heightened sensitivities in an environment where they have transitioned to war. Nobody understands where the red lines are. Our adversaries have seen that they can obviously get away with cyber operations in the gray zone at little cost and with some uneven and maybe unpredictable, but nonetheless definite impact. However, I think that once they made the decision to cross the traditional armed conflict threshold, Russia's decision makers are less certain about what actions might draw a more direct confrontation with NATO. Russia has been very clear in their efforts to deter NATO's direct involvement to the point of threatening the use of nuclear weapons. So I believe they see it as advantageous to keep a kinetic NATO out of this situation using a broad range of national power levers. However, Russia's decision makers may be less clear about how NATO would react to Russian cyber operations that might significantly and directly impact NATO critical infrastructure and military capabilities. Therefore, Russia's decision makers may be hesitant to cross that line, especially if cyber operations are not as important, flexible, or useful a tool as they were before the 24th of February. Now, even though I have relatively low confidence about this assessment, there's reason to believe that it has some merit. We've seen evidence that some of the attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure and other targets after the 24th of February have used capabilities designed to be restricted to the targets of the attacks, such as in the case of those wiper capabilities that we've seen since the 24th of February. They did not use capabilities designed to spread uncontrollably beyond the targets. So this may demonstrate concern about the unintended consequences and intention to control the impact and confine it to specific targets. However, once again, should things dramatically deteriorate for Russia, any hesitancy to use cyber operations and restrict their impact out of concerns of drawing in a direct NATO involvement would likely diminish in Russia's decision-maker calculations. So I'd like to close with a quick summary of my main points for your consideration. First, while the information age has definitely brought us great possibilities, opportunities, access to greater understanding, connection to others and as a society, it's also brought us new vulnerabilities, risks, and threats. As a result of the latter, I believe Western democracies are experiencing a time of grave concern. Second, our adversaries are leveraging these information-related capabilities to gain an advantage over Western democracies with great urgency and ever-expanding mechanisms, all while operating with near impunity and virtual anonymity in the gray zone, below that traditional threshold that would trigger an armed response from the nations that they are targeting. Third, it's easier for autocracies and repressive regimes to engage in this dynamic and more difficult for Western democracies to both defend against it because of the very freedoms like individual privacy and freedom of speech that underpin democracies, as well as to engage in these activities because I believe they're perceived by Western democracies as playing dirty. Western democracies are at a distinct disadvantage unless they're willing to get their hands dirty, because I believe this is the true nature of modern competition and conflict. Information warfare and cyber operations have moved the starting blocks forward in the racing lanes, and our adversaries have moved up their runners, while Western democracies' runners remain back at the old starting lines. Fourth, in this new domain of modern competition and conflict, responsible nations need some common operational rules of the road to prevent miscalculation and mistakes that can inadvertently lead to escalation and spill over into kinetic responses. And then finally, while the jury is still out, observations thus far from the use of information warfare and specifically cyber in the Russia-Ukraine conflict tend to show three things. Number one, that while cyber is still an option in traditional conflict, it may not be as useful a tool once the fighting begins. Number two, that a strong and resilient cyber defense built on both the sharing of cybersecurity technologies as well as cyber threat intelligence by both states and industry can be effective. And that prohibitions on cross-border data sharing for the purposes of cybersecurity might ought to be given another look. And number three, there's evidence that the use of cyber operations during traditional conflict brings uncertainty when it comes to the ability to control the impact of those operations, to contain the effects and limit direct involvement from additional nations that may not be involved yet. And this may result in concern by the initiators about where the red lines exist that might be considered as constituting an act of aggression or hostile act by those not yet directly involved in the kinetic conflict if they were impacted. So I hope you found useful my insights about adversary use of information-related capabilities and why these capabilities are so important in modern competition and conflict. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, John Davis, for that speech, and a lot to unpack there. Can I ask you, at least 3 occasions, I think, you referred to Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. You named them as the adversaries. You talked about getting our hands dirty. Let's get our hands dirty. What does the West, countries like United States and Australia, need to do to step up to this challenge? What are the things that you'd like to see done through forums such as AUKUS, the Australia, UK, United States alliance? What can be done to not just protect, but ensure that we remain on the front line in this fight against cyber terrorism?
Sure, Steve. I think the first thing is just realizing that the lines have moved, and that in fact, believe me, I'm not saying that traditional conflict is a thing of the past and is not going to happen anymore. Obviously, it is still a concern. But traditional conflict between the major powers is probably a lot less likely if our adversaries can see effective use of these capabilities short of that old line and can undermine us and weaken us and gain an advantage over us by using these capabilities without triggering what we view as traditional armed conflict. I think we should recognize that. And as I mentioned, it's not that Western democracies don't know how to do these kinds of things. Certainly we do, but we tend to hold back from doing them until we cross some type of threshold. For example, all the things I was involved in the special operations community and later with the Army, all the things that we were involved in from an information warfare perspective, we used military capabilities to do a lot of these types of things to declared adversaries under, declared hostile, a hostile environment with military orders and civilian oversight and orders to use the military to do these things, like in, hunting for persons wanted for war crimes in Bosnia and a lot of the special operations that occurred around the world. But we tend to, rightfully so, we tend to be very judicious in the use of this. We tend to be very careful and calculating because we know the impacts of unintended consequences, and we know that the risk of making mistakes is very high. And that's why I believe these operational rules of the road that I mentioned are so important, and to get even countries like China to understand that it can be in their own best interest to put a little bit more care and oversight and restraint into these things in order to prevent something. If we're going to go to war with an adversary nation, it should be an intentional decision, not a mistake. And that's what I worry about.
From the ABC, Andrew Green.
General Andrew Green from the ABC. I noted particularly your comments about needing more transparency, and that would have been very much noted in a city that, like this one, which likes to keep secrets. In the spirit of some transparency, what do you think Australia may be contributing in this current conflict from a cyber point of view? And more broadly, what's been more effective in this war? Has it been the offensive operations or the defensive operations?
Thank you, Andrew. I believe Australia believes very similar to the U.S. in terms of being more transparent. I mean, just like the U.S. announced the use of offensive cyber capabilities against ISIS, I know Australia did a similar thing several years ago. And I've seen some of the reporting now about what your administration is considering in terms of the ransomware problem and being able to openly go, more than and admit more than we have ever admitted before, and applying both law enforcement and intelligence capabilities to reduce that threat. And we know ransomware is not just a criminal activity. As I mentioned, there are connections between these criminal organizations that leverage this and nation states that inspire or turn a blind eye to, or even covertly direct and support these types of organizations. So I think that Australia and the U.S. think very similarly about what needs to occur. So did that answer your question, or was there was a second part that I forgot?
The second is to the war itself. Have offensive operations been more effective or defensive?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer. We created U.S. Cyber Command in the U.S. largely out of defensive concerns. We had a major event and we lost control of, the ability to protect some of our most sensitive networks, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back in the decision to say, this can never happen again. We need to create a component where all of this stuff comes under one person, one commander with responsibility, accountability, oversight, and even though it was a painful process to pull together, the biggest reason we created it was for defensive purposes. Very important. Offense is certainly a part of that, and you've heard, I think, General Nakasone talk about the strategy that the U.S. uses now in terms of you can't just sit back and wait. It's a defend forward, persistent engagement strategy. You don't have options to leverage these powerful offensive capabilities by waiting to the last minute. You've got to be prepared, and that requires a different posture to be able to do that, which I think is absolutely correct. But countries like ours, Australia and the U.S., who have tremendous offensive capabilities, are hesitant to use them because we live in glass houses, you know? And so that's why I think there's always this balance between offense and defense, and they're very much related and, you know, different sides of the same coin. I think that the fact that defense is so important, and rightfully so, does not obviate the need for having offensive capabilities and using them under kind of the operational rules that I laid out very responsibly when required and in support of national interest. So I wouldn't pick one over the other. I say you have to have both, but you need to be careful in how you use both of them.
From the national broadcaster to the national broadsheet, Sarah Eisen, The Australian.
Sarah Eisen from The Australian, thank you for your address. Just wanted to reflect on what you were saying about countries like Russia inspiring third parties and for cyber attacks and so on. Recently, Australia has seen a number of attacks on really critical infrastructure, including a health insurer, and up to 10 million people have had a lot of information stolen. That was revealed to be Russian in origin, and there's a lot of commentary about links to Reville, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So I wanted to ask how likely you think it is, or if you think that your comments regarding third parties being inspired by Russia are relevant in this case, if that's what's happened in this case, if you think that's likely. And secondly, if I might ask on AUKUS, as Steve has, just your reflections on this alliance. This week we've heard some calls for it to be expanded and include countries like Japan. Do you think that would be a good idea, the more allies the better, or that focusing it on these three countries, Australia, the US and the UK, is the way to go?
Thank you, Sarah. Let me start with the ransomware and the Medibank situation, et cetera. I think there's a strong possibility of a connection there. I think that any time a country like Russia, even if it may just turn a blind eye towards what's happening, if it sees what's happening from a criminal entity in the best interest of or pursuing objectives that are favorable to that country, then they may well just let it happen and then, you know, refuse to do anything about it because it's a criminal entity and they have nothing to do with it. They can deny it. There's a whole bunch of anonymity and denial capabilities associated with it. I don't have any specific insight into what that connection is, but I would just put the whole thing into the framework of be very suspicious about all these various non-state actors in today's world and how strong the connection is or isn't to state organizations and state objectives. In terms of the AUKUS, I'm not in a position to really answer that question with any definitive answer, but I think AUKUS is an opportunity. I think AUKUS is, I mean, we have all these alliances, these multilateral alliances with many, U.S. and Australia, and those are good. The more participation in it, the more complex it gets. And I believe that, you know, by limiting it to Australia, UK, and the US, I think it allows an organization to go a little quicker, to streamline things, and to make positive movement in terms of whatever the objectives are to accomplish. Not that I would advocate for excluding Japan, but there are other relationships with Japan that I think, for now, my recommendation would be, this is what you got to start with. Let's move forward with it. Let's see how it goes and make decisions from there. So I do believe, though, that one of the things that I think is very important in the AUKUS relationship is the involvement, as I mentioned in my remarks, the involvement of private sector in that relationship, both from a technology innovation perspective, from a cyber threat intelligence sharing, and maybe other types of threats intelligence sharing. Industry, especially in the cybersecurity industry, can play a significant role in assisting the common objectives of these three nations. So I would just urge the maximum use of that and leveraging all the best practices and lessons learned that we have.
Thank you.
John Davis, just to clarify, if there's a strong possibility of a connection between the criminal syndicate and the Russian government, which is essentially what you're suggesting, why does why don't we impose sanctions on those countries? I mean, at what point does it get where these cyber attacks actually the best way to respond to them is some sort of formal sanction against the Kremlin, against the Russian government?
Steve, I was a co-chair on an international ransomware task force that was sponsored by the Institute of Security Technology that began in the January of 2021, and it was focused on the ransomware problem. It had participation from almost 100 people, voluntary participation across governments internationally, law enforcement, private sector, nonprofits, academia, et cetera. And what we came up with was the idea, and I know this is just, I'm just focusing on ransomware, but I believe what we came up with in our approach to ransomware would serve well against any cyber threat. But ransomware was the flavor of the day at the time, especially after Colonial Pipeline. So what we came up with was the fact that there's never going to be any single silver bullet to solve this problem, as the case with any cyber threats. And our approach was, you need an approach that focuses on deterrence, disruption, better preparedness, and more effective response. And those aren't separate lanes, those are interrelated, but we focused on those particular functions. And so obviously, in terms of deterrence, a lot of the government-related activities that can focus around that would be things like sanctions, indictments, et cetera. It's very difficult to, it's easy to apply them. In the case of Russia, it's difficult to see any success as a result of those. So, but I think the approach I would advocate is, you know, use whatever tools in the toolkit will enable you to be most effective at reducing the overall problem, whether it's ransomware or any other threat. And I think you need all of those things.
David Crowe.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, General, for your speech. David Crowe from the Australian, David Crowe from, David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Worked at a couple of papers over my career.
You were at the Australian.
Yeah.
I remember well.
Just staying on Medibank ransomware, that's affected about 10 million consumers in Australia. And I think a lot of them would be thinking, why can't our government protect us here? And so my question is sort of about technical capability, but also the willingness to use that technical capability. If you have a Russian cyber gang doing this, do nation states have the technical capability to disrupt and stop them and take them out? And if we do, is there basically a code agreement, a law that's preventing that offensive exercise of force in the cyber realm by a nation state against basically a criminal gang? Do we need to change our thinking about using that offensive capability, or is it simply too complicated and we're not going to have that capability in the first place?
Good question. Once again, I believe that it all depends on the specific situation, the threat and how they're employing their capabilities, et cetera, who the target is, how the target's defended. I would say two things. Number one, apparently your cyber minister believes so, because she's announced the intention to really focus and prioritize going after the operational disruption of these criminal entities, maybe or maybe not supported by nation states, to come do things like Medibank. And I think that's appropriate. And it's less of concern about taking someone to court and more concerned about just stopping the pain. And so those capabilities do exist, but I would, once again, I'd urge caution in the employment of them based on, you know, responsible rules of the road, including the right oversight, the right assessment of unintended consequences. All those things are very important, but I wouldn't remove that tool from the kit bag. The other thing I'd say, though, is in my experience, most organizations that get hit by ransomware, and I believe our threat intelligence organization says that in the past year it's been 1 every 4 hours has been hit. In my experience, the vast majority of them could have stopped it with some of the most basic things and you all know what they are: multi-factor authentication, least privileged access. You know the list by now. We simply don't do a good job at preparing ourselves to prevent these in the first place, but if you can't prevent them, be prepared to respond to them effectively through leveraging best practices and, international, best standards, and rehearsing these things ahead of time and understanding who has what roles and responsibilities across the organization if you are hit, and being able to deal effectively with that. So I think there should be an effort on both parts. Government should do all it can do judiciously in order to stop the pain where it's appropriate and it can be done. But I think entities that are targeted really need to up their game. And I really don't think it's as hard as people think it is, but it does take leadership. It does take, in some cases, the investment of the right resources. But if you look at it as, a part of your business decision-making and not some technical issue that the IT person is responsible for, if it's integrated into your risk management and business decision-making, I think most leaders would understand, especially with what we're experiencing today. Look at the cost associated with a ransomware event. Even if you don't pay the ransom, you still have, reputational costs associated with it. You have all kinds of expenses associated with dealing with one of those. So I would hope that it would take, both government as well as the commercial entities that are affected and government entities that are affected, both stepping up their game. And don't forget about the private sector cybersecurity companies like ours that can assist in both of those. Both the operational disruption, I'm not saying companies like mine do offensive capabilities. I'm saying we share threat intelligence and information that might be valuable to government organizations who have the authorities to do these things. And so as well as helping organizations who might become targets of this type of an attack, help better prepare and prevent as much as they can and be in a position to respond more effectively than they have before.
Steve, can I stretch your friendship and just ask a quick follow-up question on something
Well,
related to offensive
Crowe,
capability?
much as I love you dearly, we're running over time already. Sorry. Well done on your re-election, by the way, to the National Press Club board. Harley Dennett from the Canberra Times. General, if you don't mind, we are running slightly over time, but we've got a lot of interested journalists with some...
I'm all yours.
Well, that's very kind of you. Harley.
Thank you for your address, General. Can I go back to those red lines, which obviously concern governments greatly? I imagine governments are going to be reluctant to put red lines on the table, but even if they did, they would still want assurance before that the country or the actor that they think has committed a particular act is responsible. How reliable is the fingerprinting that it gets done now, and is there an arms race with that? Where is that going next?
I think you're right about not wanting to declare very finely defined red lines, because once you do that, anything below that is fair game. And nobody, we want to discourage malign activity, whether or not it crosses what you would consider to be a red line. I know that based on my previous experience, the U.S. government was very careful not to say where the red line was, but to very intentionally vaguely describe what it would take to be an incident that might be considered to be a red line and what appropriate response would be determined. Declaring war is a political decision. And we would say that what would elevate an event to be considered as crossing that red line would be something of significant consequence in terms of a threat to national security, a threat to economic stability or viability, and a threat to public safety on a broad scale. Those kinds of, if something were to occur in the U.S. or with one of our partners and allies, and it met that very vague threshold, it would then be elevated to the point where political decision makers would have to make the determination, what are we going to do about it now? And it might well result in a use of force. Okay, what was the second part?
Where is the arms race of cyber going in terms of being able for actors to be able to hide their identity?
based on my experience, and I'm only going on my experience, particularly government and military experience, and now with the private sector cybersecurity company, this has become such a threat over time that government and industry have both invested significant amounts of resources in developing capabilities that can attribute this type of activity. It is no longer as easy as people say to hide. Now, we may not, government intelligence organizations or whomever, may not want to say publicly what they know, fully what they know. An interesting case was the North Korean attack on Sony. Pretty interesting that the President of the United States came out and said, it's the North Koreans, and made basically a stand about the fact that that was unacceptable behavior. So I think both government and industry these days, because this has become such a threat for so long, implicating national security and economic security, that it's not as easy to hide as it once used to be. Not that it's easy to make these attribution claims. It still takes a full set of capabilities to do it. All of the intelligence functions, signals intelligence, human intelligence, all of these capabilities are still important. So is the private sector. And I'd put our intelligence organization at Palo Alto Networks up against any organizations, government or commercial. They're very, very capable these days. So that's how I would say that, that should give you a little bit of faith that it's possible to figure out who's doing what. And then there's the decision of what do you do about it and what's the most appropriate thing to do about it.
Thank you very much.
Conscious of time, but we've got 2 more questions. We're going to try and race through those. Simon Gross.
Simon Gross, Canberra IQ. I'd just like to dig down deeper into your response to David Crow's question. You're basically saying that we would have the capacity to offensively take down actors like the people who've hacked Medibank and Optus, but that
I would say that we may. I don't know enough specifics yet.
Fine, yeah. But it's like a cat and mouse game. You talked earlier about we live in glass houses. Is there is that part of the problem? We're wary of exposing how we would act, because that would inform our adversaries, potential adversaries, of our skills.
Simon, I think it would be a consideration that would have to be assessed as to what you're going to give up in order to what you're going to get out of doing this. And I know that would be an assessment made at a governmental level about how far you were willing to go. But I don't have any specific information about the criminal gang behind the Medibank.
Well, the BAFP have identified them. You talked earlier about bringing down networks.
I think that should be an option to be considered and assessed.
Okay.
And final question today from the well-dressed Nick Stewart.
Thanks very much. Claire O'Neill's come out with both guns blazing, saying that she'll go after the terrorists, the cyber terrorists. On the other hand, you made the really important point that there's no silver bullet. Isn't it a problem? Say you have a terrorist who takes control of a hospital and says, we want money, otherwise we'll start turning off your capacity for ICUs and other things like that. Isn't there a problem with focusing on this attack, the offence? Isn't the first requirement really defence? I mean, if Optus didn't have an open door at the back, there wouldn't have been the hack. If Medibank Private didn't retain all this information that they didn't necessarily require, there wouldn't have been the prospects there for that. Aren't there other simple defensive mechanisms that we should actually be able to sue as people or as a government to require ordinary companies, particularly big companies like these, to actually defend themselves?
Well, I'm not going to comment on what should or should not be regulated, especially in another country. But I do agree with you that the best, most powerful thing that you can do is preparation. And part of that is defensive posture to prevent. Like I said, most of everything that I've seen could be easily prevented. It's not that sophisticated. We're making simple mistakes as organizations and as people in allowing this to happen. So I would agree with you that defense and raising our game should be everyone's first priority. But once again, I think if you look at a response, I think you got to consider the full range of things, whatever you have available in terms of deterrence and putting pressure on those countries that are unwilling to stop this and may have a hand in it, or helping countries that are unable to. Then there's disruption activities, and that's exactly what you're talking about. There's preparation, which I would place first above all else. And then there's being in a position to respond effectively, which requires rehearsal and development of roles and responsibilities and understanding what has worked and what hasn't in terms of best practices. And doing all that ahead of time. You do not want the first time you're dealing with this to be after you've hit. You want to do it in a rehearsal, in an exercise, in some kind of tabletop. And you want to involve all the people, the decision makers in your organization that might be involved, the leadership, the technical expertise, the communications people, the law enforcement involvement. There's a whole team of people that have to be able to know what they're doing in order to respond effectively, and that needs to be rehearsed.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's conclude on that note. Would you please join with me in thanking General John Davis. As always, we have a gift from the National Press Club, membership card, reciprocal rights at the Washington Press Club. They do a very nice filet mignon, so you'll enjoy that. And a bottle of Canberra's, one of Canberra's finest, Clonakilla. You'll enjoy that as well.